Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Tuesday, May the 20th. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's,
the podcast that gives you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes. Hit follow in your podcast app to have us pop up around 7:45 each morning in your feed.
This morning, the government attempts a victory lap for its deal with the EU. Rachel Reeves is out and about saying Britain is the best place for trade anywhere in Europe and never knowingly undersold, and looking for more deals in the Gulf. The EU ambassador will be talking up the deal too. I guess that's in his job description. But the government could quickly get bogged down by revolts over welfare and winter fuel today after last night's very tricky meeting of the Labour Parliamentary Party.
Meanwhile, there's no let-up in developments abroad that have a direct impact on the UK and UK diplomacy. Keir Starmer, President Macron and Mark Carney have warned that the human suffering in Gaza is intolerable and put Israel on notice that it risks breaching international law. And you see this as a particularly big deal this morning?
I do, because of the strength of language. This has definitely been notched upwards. Like here-ness, it is extremely critical of the Netanyahu government by the standards of Keir Starmer and co, and obviously having Emmanuel Macron and Mark Carney alongside gives him, if you like, sidesman to wage that battle. So interesting when it came up, Sam, in the press conference yesterday on the deal. Actually, it was your colleague Beth Rigby who raised it first. They were determined not to have it discussed yesterday, take the limelight away from the deal. But I would suggest that this is obviously going to go down very badly in Israel, but it's clearly thought necessary by all three. And I think by Keir Starmer also looking at the mood in his party and a sense that he has been silent or at least dialed down criticism of Israel for too long.
That's right. That's one to watch. We'll also be digesting the implications of the call between President Putin and Donald Trump, which ended with the US president saying that he felt it went very well and suggesting that the new American Pope might host peace talks in the Vatican, while also talking up a trade deal with Russia. That doesn't feel like a win for Ukraine. Vice President J.D. Vance said afterwards that if there wasn't a resolution soon with the war over Ukraine, the US would retreat from the conflict before long. That also doesn't feel like a win for Ukraine. So more on all of that in a bit. But we start with one psychologically horrendous piece of news, and that's for the Conservatives. This morning, the weekly YouGov, Sky News Times voting intention poll sees for the first time the Tories drop behind the Liberal Democrats. Let me just give you the numbers. Reform UK way out in front now, up 1 point on 29%. Labour second on 22%. They're down 1 on the week. Lib Dems on 17%, up 1 on the week. Tories 16%, down 2 on the week, and Greens on 10%, up 1 on the week. So we have a situation where the Tories now are 13 percentage points behind Reform, 6 percentage points behind Labour, and 1 percentage point behind the Lib Dems. And is there any reason that the Tories shouldn't panic?
You always ask me the hard questions, don't you, Sam? I don't know whether panic is ever the right response, but I think you can't look at this, and as you say, particularly that shift to moving behind the Lib Dems and just think, well, this is going to set itself right at some point. It doesn't look like it is if Kemi Badenoch continues on the course she is on. I know probably listeners might say, well, you said that a couple of weeks ago too, but I just think it does feel like it's ratcheting worse and worse. And we've seen Nick Clegg telling Lib Dems to prepare for coalition again there in the Times. I bumped into Nick, who's back from his stint at Mark Zuckerberg's Meta, looking very prosperous, as you'd expect. Somewhat free range, I think, about what he's going to do next, but very interested and engaged still in politics. And I happened to be talking to him some about a radio show I was doing marking the anniversary of the Tory Lib Dem coalition. And he was pointing out that if the Lib Dems were going to get back again, you know, they have memories, shall we put it, of that time, which is still traumatic. And there's still, as Nick and Danny Alexander wing, who have very positive memories of it. We had in the round that I was doing at a radio station for another broadcaster, Vince Cable, who was sounding very caveat emptor about ever going back near coalition again, and just sounded still very traumatized by the experience, and possibly he might suggest that life was safer in the wings. So let's see where that one goes.
The talk of coalition actually came up again in the context of the Tories last night. I was very struck that Steve Baker, the former Brexit minister, Brexit hard man, was out and about saying that he would imagine that a reform Tory future coalition would reverse the main points of yesterday's EU-UK deal post-Brexit, the trade sort of involvement, the sort of trade agreement by the two parties, but just the sort of openness of the talk about the need for reform and the Conservatives to work together is just a striking sort of feature of our politics at the moment, except around Kemi Badenoch. Just to bring us back to the EU-UK announcement yesterday and the Tories, Kemi Badenoch made a huge show yesterday. She put on a show for us. There was a press conference with Victoria Atkins rolling out the Tory response, and it was all about how this deal betrays Brexit. So in essence, trying to own the same ground that Nigel Farage and Reform UK were trying to own in this space. Because it struck me yesterday there were two possible responses if you're an opposition MP to the trade deal the agreement that the UK and the EU struck. The first is that, and the other is to say, well, actually, there's just a lot less in it than meets the eye. But instead, both Reform and the Tories are sort of, treating it a little bit like the Wizard of Oz. They're talking up the horror of it, the size of it. And I know that there are some Tories who just think that Kemi Badenoch is going down the wrong path. Ben Wallace, the former Tory Defence Secretary, big figure in the Tory party, was WhatsApping me late last night. And he said, basically saying, the way I see it, this deal is part concrete and part waffle. The concrete bit is the stuff that we had to give. That's the fishing rights for 12 years, the extension. And in return, what do we actually get? Well, in the Defence White Paper, in his view, there was almost nothing. He called it Foreign Office and Ministry of Defence waffle committees or stuff that we could already do. And he said the line of attack should be Keir Starmer is a straw man, and this should be the line that we're all being taken for fools. But instead, a more ideological approach being adopted by Kemi Badenoch. And you were at the summit and you saw it in all its glory and otherwise. What did you make of it? Which line of kind of criticism would you go down if you felt the need to criticise it?
By the end of it, Sam, and I know I came on the podcast yesterday, so, I still stand to this view that it's good to make this reconnection, etc., etc. But, I have to admit, when I heard it all laid out, I thought this is it's a very skinny latte for this time of the morning reference. And I did slightly think, oh, yeah, God, this is a bit thin. So maybe Sam had a point. So I think that is
I'm
right.
banking that. I'm banking that.
Bank that one. Bank that one. She said it. She said it, people. Be generous. I think Ben Wallace points something out there is really smart to have that conversation with him. It did feel a bit, I think straw man might be, obviously that's an attack line. Keir Starmer was stolid. He did keep going in the face of any questions or noises off. But it did feel a bit like he was having to sell quite small gains as big ones. And one that my German colleagues, I was happy to sit with my colleagues at Axel Springer, were particularly enjoying is when he said the door is open to shellfish. For real. Obviously talking about food and agri and how we were going to sell shellfish and burgers. It was going to be the great British food future on the continent. Everyone looked a little bilious. Von der Leyen standing next to Keir Starmer just had this look. I've watched her down the years, Sam, and she has that sort of impassive face, and it was a mixture of sort of grit and let's get this one over with. I mean, there obviously was a seriousness to the occasion, but I did watch Keir Starmer and think, here is someone working hard. When you can see a politician who knows he or she has to work hard to convince the audience that what was called the youth experience scheme now, we talked about the youth mobility scheme for weeks on this podcast and elsewhere, suddenly it had got watered down to something called the youth experience. It sort of reminded me of something else entirely. And I just thought, everything, as Ben Wallace was pointing out, or many things, defence, really, there was very little there, and there I do rather agree with Ben Wallace. So you could go that way, couldn't you? You could just say, he's a salesman, but don't believe it. It is waffle. I guess Kemi Badenoch, tell me what you think. I guess Kemi Badenoch's thinking, if I don't go really hard and amp it up to warp 11, as they say in Spinal Tap, then I'll have reform outdoing me on sounding sharp and even shrill on things like fisheries, and I better get over there in order not to be outdone by reform. That would be my guess.
But I suppose it depends who she thinks her audience is.
True.
And I wonder whether or not the sort of the people she's more scared of at this point are Tory MPs wanting to ape the Reform UK line in that, going down that way of criticising the government's deal, rather than the public, who, for the best, with the best will in the world, I just don't see really there being a massive public appetite to refight some of the Brexit laws. Even I got a sort of chill to the spine as we were going through, sort of particular EU structures and whether or not the European Court of Justice could be consulted in the resolution mechanism over a future participation in the electricity single market. As we were going around that nuances, I struggled to see the burghers of Walsall and Newcastle really getting that energised over the kind of accountability mechanisms over all of this. Now, look, clearly the papers have taken a very strong view. Right-wing papers this morning, the Mail, the Telegraph, have gone very hard on this being a Brexit betrayal. And I think the Sun as too. I do think that in part the 2019 election was a vote to get Brexit out of our lives, and I wonder whether a politician offering to bring Brexit back into our lives like this is what people want to hear. That's clearly Keir Starmer's calculation, and we'll have to see. We'll sort of have to see who's right. I just want to highlight one thing where I thought that there was great big opportunity for sort of trolling of this deal. This government made extremely clear claims about how it was going to help holidaymakers, and I apologise, that's the washing machine going bananas in the background. On social media,
do not use bananas near your washing machine, Sam. No. Really,
they were very clear. The Prime Minister on his own social media feed saying Brits travelling to Europe will now be able to use e-gates, basically promising that the UK could use the faster line, not the slower line, across EU airports, a big bugbear post-Brexit. And that is simply not what the deal delivers. The deal delivers something much weaker. It delivers a promise that the European Commission would tell member states that they don't have to put Brits in the slow lane anymore, right? There is no compulsion on any country from following up with this. And that's the kind of concrete sounding promise from a politician that when British holidaymakers hit airports, if it's not delivered, really, really risks being backfired. All you have to do is quote tweet the Prime Minister's social media post saying we've solved this with a picture of your long queue at the airport, wherever it is. And that is damaging for Keir Starmer. And I can't see how they ended up falling into that trap, overclaiming a desire to simplify what they negotiated, but in doing so, overstating it is just silly. But Kemi Badenoch wants to talk about European Court of, like basically the European court structures and other stuff that slightly makes my head go foggy.
This pretty much always happens when it's a measure that the EU imposed, but to take it off again, that you're right, the member states have to say, yeah, we'll do that, and we'll get on with it and deliver it. If they don't, then your criticism zones right in, because you really have put it to the front of, if that's really all you've got to say. And still, I think it's a little bit of a bubble and a sort of a urban professional sort of consideration as the standing in queues and moaning about the fact that it was Brexit. Yeah, for a lot of holidaymakers, it's relatively small amount of their time, once a year, if that. But as you say, if it's not delivered, that will be bad. I suppose that they may have kicked the tyres, or we rather hope that they bothered to do that in the EU and said, would most of your members actually quite like to get rid of these things? It simplifies things there for them as well, and in manpower, and that they're on the whole more are likely to take it off than leave it on. But as you say, that's a gamble.
But it is simply not something that the deal delivered yesterday, and it's something that might happen or might not happen, but Keir Starmer made himself vulnerable by overclaiming.
I've got to give you that one.
Very quick pivot. Welfare is also going to be a big thing on the agenda today. The Resolution Foundation has a big report on that. The Department for Work and Pensions Committee has a session. Select Committee has a session on child poverty. In her interview on LBC last night, Rachel Reeves seemed to confirm what I'd been saying last week, what The Guardian has been reporting, and others, but had been shot down by Downing Street, which is that they are listening on the winter fuel payment cut and whether or not to maybe change. She sort of signalled that she was listening particularly around the level at which winter fuel payments were withdrawn. At the moment, if you get pension credit, you keep it. If you don't, you don't. Is there a higher threshold that could be introduced? Not sure that's practically possible, but that seemed to be what she confirmed. And this all seems to come to a head potentially in the spending review. Darren Jones wasn't denying that when he was talking to Sophie Ridge, Chief Secretary of the Treasury, talking to Sky's political lead presenter last night. I'm actually struck. The winter fuel payment was withdrawn from most pensioners because this government wanted to signal that it understood that it couldn't leave what it said was a £22 billion black hole in the public finances and needed to fill some of it automatically for fear of an adverse market reaction. Now, last night I went back to a very key person in the market who's a very good reader of what's going on about whether or not there would be a backlash if Rachel Reeves backtrack on that promise. And actually, they said possibly not. Rachel Reeves is actually, funnily enough, just in the last few days in a slightly better position. The growth of GDP month-on-month figures rose a lot more sharply than people were expecting, 0.6% month-on-month last week, rather than I think they were predicting 0.1%. There are going to be very bullish retail sales figures that we're expecting on Friday of this week. And inflation, which had been due to peak at about 4.5%, probably might now peak at around 3.5%. And that's partly due to what Donald Trump's doing. And so the markets are a bit more relaxed about how Rachel Reeves sort of acts and talks when it comes to public finances and public spending. So maybe the stars are aligning where Rachel Reeves can actually now give a little bit back if she needs to politically from what's going on.
Interesting from the playbook Politico this morning that MPs really going for Keir Starmer at that meeting last night over the Island of Strangers comments for going a bit to Nigel Farage tribute band, and that he had to respond to that and said we can't out-reform reform, and that was taken by some as a signal that maybe he was going to soften that rhetoric, that it was a one-off or came over as a bit too heated. But, when you've got reform, as Keir Starmer said, now as his main opponent, you were rightly saying, Sam, earlier that Kemi may not had to sort of choose a direction, and you thought maybe she'd chosen the wrong one of a heated sort of reform-y tone in responding to the EU deal. I suspect that is still an ongoing argument in and around Keir Starmer about how you talk about immigration when you have a party surging way to your right, which seems to be connecting on it. I just thought that was an interesting detail.
I just want 1 minute on Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin's call yesterday. I read it as just quite bleak for Ukraine. Is there any other reading, Anne?
I find it hard to come up with a different reading to that. It has one thing it does have in common with the UK-EU deal, is that it's promising that it's going to be jammed tomorrow. Real progress is going to be somehow down the line, and they're going to meet again, etc., etc. Of course, that postpones the agony for Ukraine on the battlefield. And at the same time, as Donald Trump is just sounding very optimistic, he wants to talk more with Vladimir Putin. He's not saying I really want to talk more with and about Ukraine. So there was talk of crafting a memorandum on a future possible peace agreement. I mean, how many conditionals can you fit into one sentence? I did my Kremlinology stint for us, Sam, and had a look at the Kremlin website, and also listened to a quite rare interview that was handed out by a negotiator on the Putin team, and they don't normally do that. It's not very common in Russian communications, and that was a very different tone. That was pretty much saying until the conditions which had led to the outbreak of the war, which in the Kremlin's eyes is Ukraine just being Ukraine and being independent and being led by Zelensky and having the kind of elections that Russia doesn't want it to have, that there would be no end to the conflict. So no, I don't. I think they're in a quagmire.
Wow, that's quite something, that readout of that interview. And I suppose they've got J.D. Vance, who seems to be leaning in favour of withdrawal in all of his public pronouncements as well, just pushing things ineffectively in Russia's direction.
I guess so. I mean, you never quite know with J.D. Vance, because sometimes he is a little more twisty and turny, isn't he, in the way that he communicates some things than Donald Trump. The interesting thing to me there was switching in the prospect of the new Pope getting involved. And you can just see that showmanship of Donald Trump. As if this thing is going to drag on, he's going to bring new names into the frame. But in the end, the Pope may want to get involved in sense of conciliation and try anything to stop the fighting. But the one country that can stop the fighting is the aggressor, and that is Russia. And just from everything you're seeing, the repetition of the same phrases, but it's interesting, the Kremlin never moves, as I see it anyway. You follow the Russian pretty well. There could be some nuances here and there, but they never really move their talking points. And everybody else tries a bit or talks about a certain number of days, or you never hear that as well. Like maybe we'll do another partial ceasefire. It's just they just stick to their talking points and let everybody else run around the world after them. Right.
Well, that is the metaphorical spin cycle coming to the end at the same time as the literal spin cycle in the background, which means that we should probably bring the curtain down on today's podcast. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and we will see you again tomorrow for Politics at Sam and Anne's Then.
The laundryman cometh. See you tomorrow, Sam.
See you.
The first 100 days might be over, but President Trump is showing no signs of slowing down.
America will soon be greater than ever before.
So we're continuing to follow every twist and turn of this remarkable presidency.
And trying to make sense of what it all means for the US and for the rest of the world.
So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Malta Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Sky News Trump 100, wherever you get your podcasts.